Quay, hello. My name is Danielle Burns. I work as a research assistant with Dr. Marcia Ostashewski at the Center for SAM Communities at Cape Breton University. The center is working hard together with the Holy Ghost Ukrainian Catholic Parish to host a festival that marks 110 years of the parish and 60 years of the Ukrainian Hall. This hall, which has hosted many community events and activities for people of many different backgrounds over these many years. Thank you to Father Roman and to all the parish members for hosting us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered this evening in Unama'ki, part of Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral land and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The land on which we gather today at Mi'kma'ki is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Ostashewski people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and waters, which are also important to them as maritime people. The treaties recognized Mi'kmaq and Ostashewski title and established rules for what was going to be an ongoing relationship between nations. A native of Ukraine, Dr. Andrij Hornjatkevyc is a professor and linguist of Slavic languages, retired from the University of Alberta. In 2019, one of his refinements was adopted into official Ukrainian language orthography, meaning that his research here in Canada was adopted into the rules of Ukrainian language worldwide. Through his career, he taught and published on Ukrainian language, including its Canadian variants and other unique aspects. In addition to this, he is an accomplished performing and teaching bandura player and a practicing cantor in Edmonton. He is a lay historian of iconography and a musicologist member of Ukraine's National Composers Union. Tonight's talk is titled Ukrainian Language in Canada. Dr. Hornjatkevyc will explore the histories and mechanisms for transmission of Ukrainian languages to Canada, including regional subdialects, urban and rural differences, and changes over time as reflected in Ukrainian language variants among different immigrant groups. He will also discuss changes in the language of Ukrainian liturgies in Canada and what is now over 130 years of Ukrainian settlement in this part of the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hornjatkevyc.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Nicely done, Danielle. If I may, could you turn to the audience? Would that be okay?
Oh, yes.
Dr. Hornjatkevyc can see some of the audience members.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
And oh, I see Kenny has a hand up. Kenny. Or maybe he's just saying hello. Hi, everyone. All right, Dr. Hornjatkevyc.
When Ukrainians came to Canada about 130 years ago, they came mainly from a region of Western Ukraine, which has a very rich dialect inventory. Ukraine itself is subdivided into three major dialects. Let's imagine, if you have a good imagination of the map of Ukraine, draw an east-west line through KU. Anything north of that line is going to be the northern dialect. And here I'm going to be cutting a lot of corners. Then draw a line from KU down south to the Black Sea, somewhat west of Odessa. Anything of southeast of that line is the standard Ukrainian language, the standard Ukrainian dialect from which standard Ukrainian is based, on which it is based. The northern dialect, just for statistics sakes, it has about 3 subdialects. The southeast dialect has also about 3 or 4 subdialects and little else. Meanwhile, southwest of that area is subdivided into about perhaps up to 12 different subdialects. And most of the people that came in the first wave of Ukrainian settlements to North America in general, of course, including Canada, but United States were also settled at about this time, came from that large area, but actually not so much of that entire area south of that northeast-west line and west of the north-south line, but from the Piedmont, the area at the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, And mountainous areas tend to be very rich in subdialects. That because people live in little valleys and don't have too much contact with the neighboring villages. So consequently, speech patterns developed signifying or defining that area. So the people who came to North America came from that dialect. And another thing that we have to keep in mind, that when we have a wave of emigration to a new settlement, whatever the language, whatever the culture and so on, it in a certain sense freezes the language at that stage of development. We can take North America as a very fine example, that the French spoken in Quebec is more or less 18th century French. Of course, there have been influences of the more modern language, especially with modern media. But nevertheless, the language spoken by the Laine Pure of Quebec is a very old-fashioned French from the 18th or even earlier centuries. Likewise, English, the language that you and I are speaking, with little subtle differences all around, is again basically 18th century English. England, the language has developed in its own direction in Great Britain, in England especially, but in the various colonies, it has gone off on its own, but it stayed to a very great degree at this earlier stage of development when the immigration began. So likewise, Ukrainians that brought Ukrainian language to North America reflected the language of turn of the century Ukraine, turn of the 20th century Ukraine. In the meantime, the language in Ukraine has evolved very strongly in subsequent years. I remember once eavesdropping on a conversation between my mother, her sister, her daughter, and her granddaughter, 3 different generations, speaking in Ukraine on the same phone line. And I heard 3 distinct versions of Ukrainian spoken within that one family in that one city. But it was very striking to see how language evolves, how it changes. So Ukrainians have brought with them to North America this late 19th, early 20th century version of Ukrainian. And it has not developed very much, although again, people came from different subdialect areas, but in a certain sense, they adopted a compromise koine that would be that would work out for the needs of the community. Meanwhile, Ukrainian has developed. The interwar immigration was again basically from the same area of Western Ukraine, although now there were a few more speakers from an area further north from Volhynia, which had a slightly different dialect, but again, part of the Southwest dialect. Things changed very much after the Second World War, when people emigrated from all over Ukraine. Yes, the majority still were from the West, because they had the easiest time sort of getting out. But you had a very large contingent of people who came from Central Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, with their own speech patterns. So that is, in very broad outline, the picture of the language of the Ukrainian language as it evolved in Canada. Of course, what also happened, and this was often a case, a source of jokes, is how, let's say, English words and English expressions would be incorporated into Ukrainian. Sometimes, let's say, there would be exact calques. So, for instance, the common English expression, I don't care, became in Canadian Ukrainian, я не dbаю. But that's not something that a Ukrainian would never say in Ukraine. You would say meni odnakovo. It sounds totally differently, and it's a totally different sentence. But this is, again, an attempt of people that were not too strong in their Ukrainian here in North America, but drawing on their experience with the dominant language, English, how they would substitute word for word and try to make it work. Are there any questions perhaps from the audience?
Oh, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Danielle.
So I know that in Odessa, they will speak predominantly like Russian.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if there are any other parts of Ukraine that practices the same, style and, maybe even sub-dialect, and how that kind of changes things in your research.
I'm not personally involved in dialectology, but you brought up a very important point, because the south of Ukraine in general, well, if we go, let's say, past the 12th century, was pretty much unsettled. It was open space. It was the wild south, we could always call it. And it was settled by various kinds of various peoples at various different times. Although eventually Ukrainian became the dominant or the strongest majority, shall we say, so much so that it would actually influence the speech of these newcomers. My favorite examples are Mennonites, who were invited into the Russian Empire by Catherine II, and they settled in large areas of southern Ukraine. They spoke their own German language, but also very many of them took over Ukrainian as the dominant. And I had a beautiful illustration of this when Ed Schreier became the Governor General of Canada. And I was listening to this on the radio as I was sitting in my office. And he delivers his speech in English, switches to French, English, French, and so forth, suddenly switches into German. I thought to myself, wonderful, this man is respecting his heritage. And then back to English, French, Ukrainian. His Ukrainian was better than his German. I'm fluent in both languages. And I felt proud at that moment, really proud of being Canadian, to see my tradition being so honored by the most important person, technically, politically, the most important person in the country, the Governor General. So that's one small vignette, a small example. But yes, some did maintain their own culture, especially Tatars in the Crimea, but also others as well. But the, shall we say, cross-pollination between the newcomer language and the indigenous language was always in progress. It always went on. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, yes, thank you.
Okay, good. No, because I tend to go off on my own tangents, and I want to get to your question and to make sure that you are satisfied.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Dr. Hornjatkevyc, if I may.
Sure.
Many of the parish members were curious about all of the different changes in the Ukrainian language versions in the liturgy from the time of immigration to now. And I'm wondering if you could first take us through them and the reasons for them, and then how that is important in and for Ukrainian language and language speakers today.
Okay, we're talking about liturgical language. Now, I would have to go into older history, but let's just simply say that after the mission of the apostles of the Slavs, Saints Cyril and Methodius, in the late 9th century, a written language was developed based on Macedonian dialects around Thessalonica, Macedonian Slavic, not Greek, but Slavic dialects. And this became a lingua franca, as the technical term has it. In other words, a common language that would be understood by pretty much everybody, although after the Cyrilo-Methodian mission, after the first generation there, it became an artificial language. But people used it. They found it convenient, and it was workable. The way Latin worked for a very long time in Western Europe in the first millennium AD. It's only later on that French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and so forth developed as distinct from the source language, Latin. So likewise here, we had a written language which went through its own evolution. It acquired more and more local features. So then a standard was developed in 1619 by Mileti Smotretsky, a churchman, a scholar. I'm still overcoming a cold, so be patient with me, please. And this language became sort of the liturgical language of the Orthodox Slavs. I'm ignoring the Greco-Catholic aspect of Orthodoxy. Let people who are more knowledgeable talk about that. But I'll address only the linguistic aspect of it. And this was a language that, shall we say, at the beginning of the 20th century, was used by Bulgarians, Serbs, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, each one giving that same language, that same written language, their own local twist, their own local pronunciation. So let me try this. Let's take the Nicene Creed. A Bulgarian might say, "Верую в єдиного Бога Отця Вседержителя, Творця неба і землі, видимим же всем і невидимим." Something similar might come from a Serb. A Ukrainian would say, "Вірую в єдиного Бога Отця Вседержителя, Творця неба і землі, видимим же всім і невидимим." A Russian, "Верую в єдиного Бога Отця Вседержителя, Творця неба і землі, видимим же всім і невидимим." I'm pronouncing exactly the same text from the basis of several different languages. And it worked, sort of. However, ultimately, that language was artificial and not understandable. I've grown up with the Lord's Prayer in New Church Slavonic, as we'd be calling it now, where I would understand pretty much every word. But there were parts in the Divine Liturgy which, excuse me, just plain difficult. Let me take the conclusion of the cherubic hymn, and I will use it again, Ukrainian pronunciation. I think that if you're lucky, if you understand 2 or 3 words of that, no more. So obviously there was a problem. And eventually in the 20th century, various countries seized the bull by the horns, so to speak, and started translating the language into vernacular. This was especially so by Ukrainians, by Orthodox Ukrainians, when in the late 19 teens, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church was established in Ukraine, and almost immediately started translating the divine services. Well, scriptural translations were already available, but other things, especially liturgies, would have to be translated into the vernacular because the Church Slavic was no longer intelligible. Okay, this is exactly the situation we find ourselves in Canada in the early 20th century, where the majority of immigrants are Greco-Catholics, but in 1918, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada is established. And although a former student of mine, now the pastor of the local Ukrainian Orthodox cathedral here in Edmonton, assured me that the first prayer book, the Dobry Pastor, had the divine services in Church Slavonic using Ukrainian script. But Church Slavonic, its only subsequent editions were already translations when the book was published in Ukrainian vernacular. This is where Ukraine had come in, because work in translating the services into Ukrainian had already been well in motion by the 1920s and through the 1920s. So that need was immediately available. That was settled for especially the Ukrainian Orthodox community. The Ukrainian Greco-Catholic community used Church Slavonic until the Second Vatican Council, basically. The Second Vatican Council allowed for the use of vernacular in the divine services in the Roman Church, but use the local vernacular. So, of course, every nation started translating the Mass and the services into whatever vernacular. If a previous translation had not already been available, then immediately fresh ones would be made, and there would be, of course, new translations as the need arose, especially with the changes of the ritual in the Roman Church. Okay, so this gives the green light to Ukrainian Greco-Catholics. Hey, let's translate everything into Ukrainian as well, and also, because of necessity, into English. So that, in very broad strokes, is a situation of the language situation. The situation vis-a-vis language in Ukraine is a very complex one, because you had various rival Orthodox jurisdictions, and their, in a certain use of Church Slavonic was a shibboleth of sorts. Oh yes, digression. Standard literary Russian is very heavily influenced by Church Slavonic, very, very heavily. So Church Slavonic words are used for practically every occasion, especially if it's a more solemn one. And consequently, the Russian Orthodox Church sees no need for itself, or has not seen so far, a need to translate the services into vernacular Russian. But that's another story. But have I begun to answer your question, Dr. Ostashewski?
Yes, and I have some more questions, but I'm wondering.
Go ahead, please do.
Actually, I'm wondering if there are some questions from at the hall. Father Roman has his hand up.
Yes.
Hello, Professor. Just I have a couple of questions, but I'll start off with only one. The adaptation of foreign words into the Ukrainian language, both in Ukraine and here in Canada. In Ukraine, we borrowed heavily from the French. Trottoir, the sidewalk is straight from French. From the Germans, Kartoffel is right from the Germans. And in Canada, there's the tradition of taking English words and putting a Ukrainian ending on it. And I encountered this with my uncle out west, and he was getting into his car, and he turned to his mother, and he goes, "Vajay mama boyabekayu." And I didn't understand the last word. Watch out, mother, because I'm going in reverse. But he used back up with the Ukrainian ending. And that out west, that's quite popular to encounter, more so than from people who came after World War II. So like my parents. And just another comment, when I go back to Ukraine, the little children have a good laugh of me because they say I speak like their grandparents. So I speak Ukrainian from 1942, 1941, 1942. And so that is my base. And I have a hard time understanding the Ukrainians who came recently, especially not just their words, not just their diction, but the speed at which they speak. I cannot follow a Ukrainian program on TV with the modern announcers. They're just too fast on their feet, as it were. So I just wrote all these things. Is there any sort of academic explanation as to the borrowed words? Who's the authority on accepting a foreign word and making it part of the language repertoire, like trottoir, kartofля, Is that just a local decision that catches on? Or
You've touched on a number of very important topics. First of all, let's try to tackle the question of borrowings. There is no language which is intrinsically pure, no human language that we know. Every language borrows some words, some expressions, other idiosyncrasies from some neighboring language. That is a perfectly natural thing, and that is accepted. It's an accepted fact. Yes, for instance, l'Académie Française in France tried to maintain a purity of the French language and avoid all of these English, especially borrowings. And they said, okay, let's say about Saturday and Sunday about la fin de semaine. But everybody in France says, no, we can't. And l'Académie Française can do nothing about it, unfortunately, for their sake. And so this is as a new reality comes into the language. And let's remember, you've given an excellent example with potatoes, kartofla. Let's remember that that is a New World plant. It was imported into Europe, and there were all kinds of translation or names sought for it. And the German Kartoffel is really a corruption of Erdapfel, which is an earth apple, and pomme de terre in France. You have a parallel of these things going on. And and then other words came into Ukrainian for the same vegetable, bulba, and others also. So borrowings, especially given that here we're dealing with a new plant, which becomes a very important part of the diet, which helps you survive some very rough times. Well, it came from North America. Nobody had the idea of taking the whatever, nahuatl or mikma or whatever other word for it and use that in Europe. No, they gave it a picturesque name, earth apple, and then you're taking it from there. So, and trottoir, that's another thing, because very many of those French borrowings came into Ukrainian via Russian, not directly from France, but via Russian. That's another long chapter. Excuse me. Whereas German borrowings came in more naturally, because after all, the part of Ukraine for which most of our settlers here came from a German-speaking empire, namely Austro-Hungary. So it was quite natural to use Germanic words. As far as budu bekuvati, bekapati, or whatever your ancestors said, well, this was a subject of much humor in the interwar period with the cartoons of Yaku Majdanek out of Winnipeg, who actually had a church role because he owned Providence, a religious goods store. But on the side, he drew these comics, Vuikoshtiv, in which he have all of these anglicisms and malaprops put up for ridicule. Very successful publication that went through reprintings. I don't know how many of them, but when I arrived in 1973 into Canada from the States, where Vuikoshtiv was unknown, but here I came across him and I saw that this was a very recent reprint. Happily, my dad was still alive at that time. So, but anyway, that is again a very graphic example, pun intended, of how the language is influenced by the surroundings, the surrounding vernacular.
If I may, Dr. Hornjatkevyc.
Yes.
Actually, last week, we were shown the cover of one of those comics by John Paul Himka when he was talking about iconography and the circulation of images in print. So anyway, that's a really nice connection between the two talks.
Exactly. It's all one culture all together. So there I've tried to explain to, at least to some degree, I hope Father will appreciate my attempt of the situation in the church. How also the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, which very proudly maintained its Ukrainian identity. But the latest edition of that same prayer book, Dobry Pastor, is now published bilingually on facing pages, Ukrainian text on the left, or English text on the right. An excellent prayer book, by the way, beautifully done. I don't have the very latest edition, but that's another story. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? Parishioners?
It's hard to see if anyone's hands are up, so you can let us know, Danielle. I did want to actually ask you about that tangent you were going to go on, and that has to do with Russia relations. And I also want to just, if I may, remember to you a discussion that we had recently about the influences of Lithuanians in Ukrainian, which is a much older influence, perhaps than, say, the Austro-Hungarian one. And just wondering if you can explain a little bit about that history. We in Canada tend to think, oh, these Ukrainians just came from Ukraine, and like there was just kind of, but the whole history of the peoples and the language prior to this coming this way is really lost to many people.
You brought up Lithuania. That's a very complicated question, because what we have after the fall of the Kievan Rus and that entire federation, let's call it, because although we like to think of it as this huge area of real estate in Eastern Europe, well, it was always a rather loose federation of various principalities, and who were not always in great agreement with each other anyway. But after the Fourth Crusade, which devastated Constantinople in 1204, thank you very much, Crusaders, the north-south trade route became less significant, which had been the main economy for Kievan Rus, from way up north around Novgorod to Kyiv and Pereyaslav slightly further south. But when the Mongol invasion occurred around 1240, the country was devastated. The independence was maintained in Western Ukraine, in the Galician, Volhynian First Principality and then Kingdom, but that also folded around 1340. Now, the north, and especially the northwest, and the northwest, they developed a new powerful state, Lithuania. However, Lithuania was very interesting in this respect, that although Lithuania has its own language, but the state did not use Lithuanian as the state language, but used the local Slavic vernacular, primarily Belarusian. And it's only Reformation times that we get the first printed or written text in Lithuanian as such. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania operated in Slavic, an ancestor of modern Belarusian. So the influence, as you can see, that the Slavic became much more dominant than the Lithuanian conqueror in terms of official use. So therefore, the impact of Lithuanian words into Slavic is weak. It is, you can feel that, I'm told, in Belarusian, but not in Ukrainian. I know some words which may be a common inheritance So for instance, yantar for amber. And I believe that the Lithuanian corresponding is gintaras. And I may be totally wrong here. I know I've heard the word gintaras, and I believe that that does mean amber, I believe. And a linguist can tell you, oh yes, it is related to yantar. But then we use the, perhaps even more commonly, the German name, Burstein, for Bernstein. Yes, that's right.
What's that? What does that mean?
Amber.
Oh, they're all words for amber.
Exactly. So there you have the picture. So as far as Lithuanian influence, although politically, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania did incorporate until the Union of Lublin of 1569, when the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland became a unitary state, the Respublika. You had, but the linguistic influence of Lithuanian on Slavic is minimal, and Ukrainian especially.
This is really helpful to understand the different ways that, histories and exchanges between people shape language, right? And over time, as well as like with geographical proximity or movements of people. I know that some of the parish members had asked me before about, the different ways in which Ukrainian is spoken in different parts of Canada and amongst different groups. So I'm wondering if you could speak more about that and perhaps provide examples and some discussion.
Similarly, and analogies limp and some on both legs. Similarly, as English, as spoken in Canada, is in urban Canada, correction, is pretty much the same from Newfoundland to British Columbia. The English spoken in cities is very, very similar, thanks to no small degree to electronic media, radio and television. Rural English will change. That you will have, that is a very distinct Newfoundland dialect, and there will be different dialects of English throughout the country. But nevertheless, I believe that the differences are not that huge. I may be totally wrong about this. I am not a specialist in English, and certainly not Canadian English, so don't quote me. Not reliable. Now, Ukrainian. What happens is, as a result of the settlement, and here, Dr. Ostashewski, you are a very good specialist on the field, that in Western Canada, in the three prairie provinces, you did not have much of a transfer of one community from Western Ukraine together into some new settlement in Alberta or Manitoba or Saskatchewan. People got mixed up in Canada. Yes, there may have been some, so for instance, the iconic Philippe Dielignac, who settled in Alberta, who had come from the Bayou. And of course, they brought that language with them. And yes, they did encourage a lot of people from the Bayou to come over. But as other people found out, because Philippe and Dielignac were not the only apostles of immigration, Olescu had, through his brochure, had done the line's work. And a lot of people in Galicia found out, hey, this is a good place to settle, and at what seemed to be virtually ideal conditions. Well, they weren't quite ideal when it all came down to it, but nevertheless, they came and they settled and they thrived, ultimately. So you had, but again, what I'm trying to depict is in the first wave, that you had people from more or less the same general linguistic area, where there would be differences, definitely, but not such differences that you would have a hard time communicating. And consequently, perhaps a Ukrainian koine developed in Western Canada thanks to newspapers, that people would read and more or less adapt to that. Things changed with the second wave when you had more of an urban immigration, although you still had your rural immigration. And they would have brought in Ukrainian, as Father very well pointed out, that people in Ukraine told him that he speaks like 1940s. Exactly. Basically, that's the language I speak. It's 1940s Ukrainian. Although when I visited my native village, I was told that I speak just like the local. Thank you, Mother, I said. That I picked up, and there I feel, well, I've been all over Ukraine, but and I make my way understood. I can get work my way through very easily, pretty much everywhere with standard Ukrainian. But my intonation is quite different from the local intonation, except in my village. So, getting back to your question, I hope ultimately is that things changed. I think more to a greater degree, because of the greater variety of Ukrainians that came after the Second World War, the third wave, that there you would have a more variety. But I suspect that because most of the third wave, I think the majority of them settled in cities. So there again, you would have the urban phenomenon of sort of amalgamation of various speech patterns. And again, sort of a emigre Ukrainian koine developing in Canadian cities. Now from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC. And especially now with the fourth wave, again, people who come from all over Ukraine, perhaps a large percentage, but by no means exclusively Western Ukraine, a significant percentage, but I doubt whether it's even close to half of the 50% mark.
Thank you.
Um,
Danielle,
we
I
have a
wonder
question.
if there are any questions
Yes.
in the hall.
Yeah, we have a question from Father Roman.
Yes, Father.
Professor, we have the
Glad to
pleasure
meet you,
of having-
Father.
We're having the pleasure of having with us the pastor of the Polish church here in
Aha.
Sydney. And it just reminded me that political borders are not always the same as demographic borders.
No
So
way.
there are parts of Ukraine that has a very strong Polish presence, parts of Poland, Paramyshil area that has a strong Ukrainian presence. How does being in both for the Poles in Ukraine and Ukrainians in Poland, how does that affect the development and the passing on of the language? Is it affected by, is there pressure, local pressure, or is there some sort of stubbornness to keep your language in spite of being found in another country? So
Well, here we again have to go into history a little bit, because still under Austro-Hungary, the crown land of Galicia Lodomeria, as it was officially called, was Ukrainian in the east and Polish in the west. But there was a very strong Polish presence in Ukrainian cities and towns. And this, of course, had a strong influence. Furthermore, although under Austria, supposedly, equal rights should have been given to all ethnic groups in the empire, some were definitely given more preference than others. And Polish, for a variety of historical reasons, had a very high prestige, because, after all, a large part of Ukraine, especially after the Union of Lublin, 1569, excuse me, that in the kingdom area, because also as a result of that union, parts that had been under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were transferred to the Polish crown. So that covered most of Ukraine, west of the Dnipro. Okay, so of course, Polish had a very strong tradition and a great prestige. And this had an impact on Ukrainian vernacular as spoken, especially since the local merchant, the local magistrate may be Polish speaking, and this had its impact. It's interesting how things which were really very complicated, shall we say, and I'm trying to be diplomatic, let's say 100 years ago between Ukrainians and Poles in Western, what is now Western Ukraine, and how things have dramatically changed this year, where Poland welcomed with open arms all these Ukrainian refugees and is going out way out on a limb to accommodate these people, to help them in every possible way. Bardzo dziękuję, Polsko. I hope you heard that, Father.
I heard, thank you. I had a question too, Peter. I was talking with Father Roman today at lunch, mentioning I spent a little over a year in Saskatchewan recently, a year ago. I came back.
Father, can you come closer because the microphone doesn't pick it up as well?
I was saying I had lunch with Father Roman today. I was telling him about my experience in Saskatchewan. I came back a year ago, last August, from about 13 months there. And I often on my day off, I would go out to see the rural Polish settlements, which you could not separate from Ukrainian settlements. The Poles were always a minority in Saskatchewan among the larger Ukrainian communities. And I was amazed how the influence of Ukrainian language over the Poles, some of our priests shared in their memoirs when they came here in the 1960s. Some were sent to rural communities, or there was a Polish church, and they celebrate the first Sunday at their church. People are praying, singing in Polish in church. They step out the door and they're speaking Ukrainian because they're neighbors all around, are there. And plus they came, I presume, I know almost all the Polish settlement that came before World War II, and that was from Galicia, from that eastern region where they were probably mixed populations where Poles knew the Ukrainian language. So that was an interesting thing that's been a phenomenon that exists. I had another question though about one aspect. Maybe it's not so much important in Canada as United States, but I graduated from high school, Greek Catholic high school, Byzantine Catholic high school in Parma, Ohio. Today it's the center of the eparchy of Parma. But yes, that is the Ruthenian eparchy. And the people always, from my time in the high school, I remember they referred to themselves as Rusyns.
Yes.
And yet 1 mile away from my high school, the eparchy of Parma of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, there was a St. Joseph's High School in their cathedral. And how is it that, why is that yet that language is, how do the Ukrainians look upon those people who identify, I think they use the Podkarpatsky Rusi, and is it part of the Ukrainian language in your opinion? It's like a dialect. Is it because of the Hungarian Slovak background of the areas where they came from, and the below the Tatra Mountains or whatever, that some of them do not want to be part of the greater Ukrainian community?
That is a uniquely US phenomenon in the Greco-Catholic Church, that you had immigration from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, what I had been speaking about was primarily Ukrainian immigration from Galicia and there. There was also a significant immigration from Transcarpathia, as we called it in Ukrainian. And that was the area south of the Carpathian Mountains, which until 1918 was under the Hungarian crown in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That area of what is now Ukraine was for about almost 1,000 years well, just about really, yes, 1,000 years, were under Hungarian domination, and with all the bad effects of feudalism thrown in for bad measure. And there were some local peculiarities. Actually, Dr. Ostashewski had done some research in this Transcarpathian church chant, which has the same theoretical framework as Galician and Central Ukrainian church chant, but totally different melodies that could not be related the way, let's say, Galician chant and Kievan chant can be related. One can see the similarities in spite of all the differences. But nevertheless, Transcarpathian chant is totally different. So when a Greco-Catholic jurisdiction was established in the United States in the late 19th century, all Greco-Catholics were under one bishop. But then, and political elements cannot be discounted here, the people who came from Transcarpathia felt unease within this one predominantly Ukrainian jurisdiction, and established their own jurisdiction with the blessing of the Vatican. So now we have two churches sui generis in the United States. I'm not aware of them anywhere else that this, although the picture in Transcarpathia itself may be, again, not straightforward. Anyway, so yes, there are two coexisting and coterminal eparchies. You have the Ukrainian eparchy of Parma and the Transcarpathian or Rusin or whatever you wish to call them, they wish to call themselves, of Parma. I don't remember what their cathedral is. I know that, as you pointed out, that it's St. Josaphat, I believe, for the Ukrainians in Parma.
Since we are on the kind of the topic of nationhood and identity, if I may, I know we have just a few minutes left, but I'm wondering if you could speak very briefly, tell us who Taras Shevchenko is, because he appears in the church walls and this festival is about Ukrainian history and culture, and again, briefly about his significance in modern Ukrainian language.
It's very interesting that the translation of the Bible into various vernaculars often came to serve to sort of identify that people would do. So for instance, the classical example, to me at least, is Martin Luther's translation of the Bible into German, which basically defined what German is. It's interesting that in Ukrainian, the first editions of the complete Bible, using the Masoretic and not the Septuagint text for the Old Testament, appeared in the early 20th century. But what crystallized, because until the 19th century, Ukrainian was still written in this sort of bookish dialect, which did not reflect the vernacular. And then in the very late 18th century, Ivan Kotlarevsky's Eneida, this epic poem, very humorous, riotously funny, it came out, which established Ukrainian vernacular as sort of it. But Kotlarevsky's Eneida was very important, but it served only sort of a small segment of the population or whatever, the needs. Although Kotlarevsky did take the local Poltava dialect and raised it to a literary standard. But then later on, Shevchenko came on the scene. His first Kobzar, the first collection of poetry, appears in 1840, followed by other editions and other versions or subsequent works, which took that language and broadens its scope to a far greater degree than Kotlarevsky did. Also, the content of Shevchenko's works, okay, let's see if this will help. There, that may be better. Anyway, Kotlarevsky's work was, appealed to a lot of people. Well, no, really, he reached at his time a rather narrow audience. Shevchenko, on the other hand, because of his biography and the way it went on, not only wrote literature for enjoyment, the way Kotlяревsky's Eneida was, but he addressed social issues of his times as well, and other philosophical questions, which had a very broad impact. And in the early 1960s, when the centennial of Shevchenko's birth and burial, two similar dates came up, Ivan Drac wrote a beautiful poem. I remember when I was first reading it, I was just starting my graduate work at that time, and it bowled me over. It was so powerful. But then he says, he has this mythical image of various people carrying Shevchenko's coffin to his burial mound. And by very interesting people who carry him, Shakespeare among them, Goya, Pushkin, and somebody else as well. And the procession is followed by a bunch of people. And he says that they were followed by Rusins, small Russians, locals, and so forth, to be called Ukrainians from henceforth. Щоб зватись українцями віднині. Powerful, those two lines in that poem. But that explains, in a poetic form, to be sure, but the significance of Shevchenko. Beforehand, the question of who am I, and so on, was vague, ill-defined. Literature was appearing, yes, in the vernacular, yes, but nevertheless, it's Shevchenko who gives sort of the identity. This is what we are, and this is who we are.
Thank you. I know we have to end very soon, Danielle. I don't know if you have any other questions, but someone has texted me. Do you see Ken Horacek there in the Zoom, Dr. Hornjatkevyc?
Yes.
He's unfortunately suffered even greater hurricane damages than my own house did, and so many others.
I'm so sorry to hear
he's struggling with internet, but he texted me. He would like me to ask you a question for him. He said, my Baba would say when things went wrong, "What a bombolia." Do you have any idea of the origin of this expression?
I'm afraid I don't. Sorry.
It may be a word she created, I suppose.
I think I've heard it before, but I'm sorry. Total blank. Sorry, Ken. Apologies.
Sorry, Danielle?
Yeah, she did.
They're just discussing how Kenny's father grew up in a Polish-Ukrainian home. So,
Or his Baba, she grew up,
yeah.
his great-grandparents were Polish-Ukrainian.
So maybe it was like a mix between the two.
Actually, the same can be said for me.
Yeah. Danielle, were there any other questions from the floor?
I think all of our questions have been answered. Thank you.
So grateful, Dr. Hornjatkevyc. And
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Danielle and Father Roman. Thank you, Danielle and Father Roman, for hosting us all, and to the community for this wonderful event. Thank you, Dr. Hornjatkevyc.
Thank you. And this is ASL. People who know ASL know what this means.
I love you.
Exactly. You got it. I love you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Smacznego. I hope you'll be. I understand there were are to be some refreshments there, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the hall? Yes? No? Maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. In that case, smacznego.
It's always open.
Yeah.